Okay, so welcome all of you. Our topic tonight is free will, the nature of free will. And this is, I'm making more copies will come shortly for those who wait. In the history of philosophy and human thought, one of the most debated subjects always is the nature of free will. And it's something that we experience every moment of our waking lives, and it's something that philosophers and theologians tend to deny very frequently. So that's going to be the subject of our reflection. And it's for those of you who went to Mass this morning, that was precisely the reading today, that our Lord spoke, the truth will set us free, the relationship between freedom and truth, and conversely, the relationship between freedom and sin. And we'll get to that later on in the talk. But before we do that, let's start by looking at the nature of the human will. And so, because freedom is in our will, and so to understand human freedom, we have to understand a little bit the nature of the will and how it moves. And the key thing is that our will presupposes our intellect. You can't love what you don't know. And so we can't will something that we don't know. We have to first recognize something to be good, and then we can will it. And so without intellectual knowledge, there could be no will. And just as in earlier talks we looked at the intellect and we saw how it was open to all being and all truth, and that's what makes us in the image and likeness of God. Well, likewise, our will is open to all goodness, precisely because it follows that our intellect, which knows all truth, universal truth. And that's the fact that our will is open to universal goodness is precisely why we can't find complete satisfaction in something that isn't universal goodness, like creatures. And that's the reason for St. Augustine's great phrase, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord. Our heart is restless until it rests in you." Well, because only God is the good, the universal good. Right? Our will is such a noble faculty that it can only be satisfied by God alone. Now, before we show the freedom of the will, let's start by looking at natural desire. The will isn't free in every respect, the human will. There are some things that we naturally desire and not by free choice. And that's the basis by which we freely choose other things. And it's the same with the intellect. There are certain things that we know without a demonstration, self-evident truth. And we don't need to prove those things, and that's foolish to try and prove the self-evident. On the basis of those self-evident truths that we know by nature, then we grasp other things by proving them. And it's the same in the will. The will naturally desires happiness, complete goodness. And whatever we see naturally to be a part of that. And then on the basis of that, we freely choose the means to get to happiness. So we naturally desire happiness, the good in general, and also we said what we naturally grasp to be included in happiness. And that would be, for example, life. You can't be happy unless you are and are alive. And likewise, knowledge. We grasp that knowledge is a fundamental part of the good. And likewise, communion and friendship, etc. So we have a natural desire for those things. But we're free to choose the means to realize those natural desires. Now, freedom, like love, which we looked at last time, we saw that love has so many different meanings, and sometimes we wonder why, wouldn't it have been better if there were different words for those different meanings? But we said no, because it enables the word to act like a staircase leading up to God. And the same thing is true of freedom. Freedom has more than one meaning. And so that's part of what is confusing about talking about freedom. Very often people argue about whether we have freedom or not, and we're using the word freedom in different senses without realizing it. There was a philosopher, Mortimer Adler, who did a study on the different meanings of the word freedom. And he wrote something like well over 1,000-page book on the different meanings of freedom in the history of thought. And he came up with, despite all the diversity, there are fundamentally three meanings of the word freedom that philosophers speak about, or theologians. And he calls them natural freedom, which I'm going to call free will, circumstantial freedom, which is freedom from coercion, and acquired freedom, which is freedom for the good. I'll go over that again. We could express it with three different pronouns: freedom from, freedom between, and freedom for. Freedom from coercion, that might be the most basic sense in terms of our sense experience. Freedom from slavery, freedom from bondage, freedom from prison, freedom from being tied up, freedom from coercion. Right? That's the most sensible aspect of freedom. And that's generally what people think of when they think of freedom. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. No one's going to coerce me. But it's not the most profound sense, ultimately. More profound is freedom between. We're free because we can choose between different goods. Freedom between this and that. Right? Freedom to choose. Freedom to choose this or that, or freedom to act or not to act. Right? And that's really what we mean by free will. Right? And that's the principal thing we're going to talk about. And then there's a third kind, freedom for, which he calls Adler calls acquired freedom. We could call virtuous freedom, the freedom for the good, the freedom to attain our final end, freedom for God, ultimately. Right? And that's a freedom that we have to grow into. Right? That's a freedom that is the goal of our lives, to get that kind of freedom. Virtuous freedom. And so of these three, which is ultimately the most important? The last, freedom for the good. Because that's the reason for the other two kinds. That's the purpose of freedom. Right? Freedom is for the good. But in order to be free for the good, we have to be free between. In other words, free to chart a course for ourselves. And then, in order to do that, we have to be free from coercion. Right? So all three go together. Right? So, freedom from, freedom between different goods, and freedom for the good. Let's focus first on freedom between different goods, free will, the ability to choose this or that. And human experience, everyday life, shows us that we have this kind of freedom all day long. Right? Because all day long, we're choosing this or that. We're choosing to get up in the morning with our alarm clock, or to turn it off and go back to bed. We're choosing to eat, this kind of cereal or that kind of cereal. And it's also a revealed truth. It's a beautiful passage of Ben Sira. It was he who created man in the beginning. It was God who created man in the beginning, and he left him in the power of his own inclination. Right? God left us in the power of our own inclination. If you will, you can keep the commandments. And to act faithfully is a matter of your choice. He has placed before you fire and water. Stretch out your hand for whatever you wish. Before a man are life and death. Whichever he chooses will be given to him. And we all know that that's true from our everyday experience. Or we see it right at the beginning of human history. First in the garden, the freedom that Adam and Eve had to follow the commandment or not. And we see it in Genesis 4, right after the fall, with the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain is jealous of Abel. He's about to kill him, and God speaks to him. And he says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. And that means that he has the real capacity to master it, and thus has free will. Okay, how else do we see that we have free will? Well, first of all day long, we give people moral exhortations. Right? We praise them or we blame them for what they've done. Right? But you only praise or blame an action that was free. Right? You don't praise or blame, a rock that fell, or something that we couldn't have done otherwise. Right? Ultimately, isn't praiseworthy or worthy of blame. And so if we didn't have free will, all praise, blame, exhortation, reward, and punishment would be pointless. That's ridiculous. Okay. And then we have the experience of choosing all day long. And third, we see we have free will by our own experience of remorse. Right? We don't experience, or we shouldn't experience remorse about things that were involuntary. No, we experience remorse precisely about what we know we could have done otherwise. Right? We could have and should have done otherwise. And so the very experience of remorse shows us our free will. And finally, philosophers demonstrate free will on the basis of reason. Right? So because we have reason, we're free. And in fact, God couldn't make a rational creature not free. Because reason, by having the capacity of reason, we can deliberate about different goods and see them as fitting for our end, for happiness, or not fitting. And that very capacity to deliberate about different goods as being more fitting or less fitting makes us free to choose what we think is more fitting in one way. But we could easily think that something else was more fitting in some other way. And so our capacity to order means to ends is what makes us free. In other words, because we can grasp the universal, which is our goal, happiness, the good, or even on a lower level, health, knowledge, because we can grasp the universal, and we can grasp particulars as ordered to that universal, and lots of particulars ordered in different ways, we can choose this or that. Right? We're looking for a house. We want a house. And, well, the houses can be made all different ways. 1 story or 2 stories, or round or square, or beautiful or ugly, or utilitarian, or there's so many different ways. And that's what makes us free to choose this or that. Right? Because we can know the end, and we can know different ways of getting to the end, we're free. Right? We can have the end of, say, knowledge, and I can think of a way of getting it, reading a good philosopher or reading a bad philosopher, because somebody told me he was good. So I could read, I could read the Gospels, or I could read Nietzsche or Sartre. And we're free to pick the one or the other. And we'll pick them because we think one is fitting in some way. But we could easily well think something else is fitting. And so because we can deliberate, we're free. And that's why if somebody can't deliberate because they've had some kind of brain damage, they can't exercise free will. Right? And that they won't have moral responsibility. Right? So it's deliberation, the capacity to deliberate, that enables us to exercise our freedom. Now, we're free with regard to the means. Now, somebody might object, God is the total good. But we all know by experience that we're also free to direct our lives to God or not, or to something else. And the reason for that is, even though God is the total good, we don't see that clearly here below. In heaven, the blessed see that God is the good. And so in heaven, it's impossible for any of the blessed to not direct their whole hearts and lives to God. But here we can, because we don't see that He's the good, and thus we could think, mistakenly, tragically, that something else would be better. No, and that's what happened to Eve, right, in the garden. She thought autonomy would be better than obedience to God. And we're still free, even if it seems obvious that one choice is better than another. Because even though one choice is much better than another, there's still going to be some way in which the other choice has some aspect that attracts. So, for example, I don't know, I want health, and exercising and diet is much better, but eating this chocolate cake, all right, it's not better, but it has something that can attract me. And so I can still choose it, even though I know it's not better. And we do it all the time. Right? And so our freedom, it comes from our capacity to deliberate, and there's not any finite good that doesn't have some negative point that we could look at it from, and there's not any, likewise, it doesn't have some positive point that we could look at it from, even though it might be very mistaken. Okay. Let's look at the denials of free will. And so the history of human thought, of philosophy and theology, is surprisingly a history of the different kinds of denials, different ways to deny that we have free will. And we see this from the beginning, and we see it today. One of the first heresy in the history of the church was a kind of denial of free will. It was the Gnostics, and then later the Manichees. The Gnostics said that the cause of evil isn't free will, but is our bodies. The fact that we've got material bodies. And therefore, matter by its very nature is evil, and with a kind of necessity is the cause of evil, rather than my free will to govern my body or not to govern it. And even somebody as brilliant as St. Augustine fell into that way of thinking, we know, for almost a decade. And so there's got to be some kind of temptation. That way of thinking attracts us because it means we're not morally responsible. Right? It's very convenient. And we see this in all different forms in the history of thought. A different way that free will was denied, in a much more subtle and theological way, was that came to the fore at the Reformation. So let's look at that now. Luther and Calvin denied the freedom of the will and connected it with original sin. In other words, after original sin, human nature was corrupted so much that free will, in any meaningful sense of freedom for good, was lost. Now, they didn't make clear distinctions between these three kinds of freedom, which was part of the problem. And especially in Luther's case, he speaks with tremendous passion because this was a tremendously important experiential issue for him. He was wrestling profoundly with scruples in his early religious life before he broke with the church. And I'm going to totally butcher and oversimplify this, but in the grip of very strong scruples is the inability to distinguish between what one does freely as a result of free choice and merely what one is tempted to do but doesn't consent to. In other words, the inability to recognize where I've consented and where I haven't, caused by a tremendous passion of fear for salvation of my soul. And this is a common malady in the spiritual life, and Luther was by no means alone in suffering for this, and that's not his fault. But the way out, the way that he chose to solve that problem was the problem. And his solution was to deny our freedom to resist concupiscence. In his early period, before he broke with Rome, we have commentaries on the Psalms, and Psalm 51 has that line on original sin, that in sin I was conceived, King David says. No, it's the penitential psalm. And Luther, commenting on that, says, it is a great wisdom to know that we are nothing but sin, that we do not think of sin as simply, define it as something said, done, or thought against the law of God, but rather we define it as all that is born of father and mother. In other words, it's as if it's all of human life. And that's an exaggeration. And so he ended up, especially in debate with Erasmus, clearly denying free will and our ability to resist grace or not. And he gives various arguments. One argument comes from God's foreknowledge and omnipotence. Right? If God foreknows what we will do tomorrow, how are we free to do it or not to do it? So he writes, it is fundamentally necessary and wholesome for Christians to know that God foreknows nothing contingently. It's true, right? He foresees and he does all things according to his immutable, eternal, infallible will. This bombshell knocks free will flat and utterly smashes it, shatters it. So that those who want to assert it must either deny my bombshell or pretend not to notice it or find some way of dodging it. That's true, right? If we want to assert free will, we have to show how it's compatible with God's foreknowledge from all eternity. And so it's most certainly true, so let's try and respond. It's most certainly true that God foreknows all things. No? And that's why there can be prophecy in the Bible. Right? The Bible is full of the evidence that God foreknows our future free acts. But this problem was solved in the early church. Right? The St. Augustine and Boethius and other thinkers, St. Thomas develops what they wrote. The solution is that God's foreknowledge doesn't necessitate our free act. And we can see that in a kind of analogy by our own experience. Right now, I see all of you. The fact that I see you looking at me or being attentive or not being attentive doesn't take away your free will in doing that. Right? It's just that I see it. It's present to me. So my knowing it doesn't take away your freedom in doing whatever you're doing. Well, it's the same with God. In other words, the fact that God has all of our actions present to Him doesn't take away our freedom. He just sees them. It's just that He sees things differently than we do. Right? We see things in time. So something future, it's like if we're standing in the middle of a line, we can see the person, in front of us and behind us, but we can't see the person 10 in front, or 100 in front, or 1,000 in front. But if you were at the top of a mountain looking down at a line, you'd see the whole line, right? And just equally. And that's how God looks at the world. He's not in time so that He can only see what's happening, next to us, right? But He's above it. And so He knows all things in His way of being, which is unchangeably, eternally. So what we do today It's present to him, and so he knows it without that forcing us to do what we're going to do. Right? And the same thing goes for tomorrow. What we're going to do tomorrow is present to his eternity, now, but that doesn't necessitate, right? That doesn't make me necessitated any more than I'm necessitated right now, and God sees it, and you see it, right? All right, so that's one argument against free will, and it doesn't work. But you can see how it's persuasive, because when we start to think about God's eternity, the mind gets paralyzed, no? Luther gives another argument. He says that human will, so the first one is God's foreknowledge. The second one is irresistible grace. The human will can't resist, according to Luther, either the influence of God or Satan. And so he makes this famous comparison of our free will to a rider on a horse. And our free will would be like the horse, and we're ridden either by God, by Christ, or by Satan. And if Christ rides us, we'll go in the right direction, and if Satan rides us, we'll go in the opposite. He says, we are under the God of this world. That would be Satan. Strangers to the work of God's Spirit. If we're under the God of this world, we are led captive by him at his will, so that we can't will anything but what he wills. For he is a strong man armed, who keeps his palace. So man's will is like a beast standing between two riders. If God rides it, it will go where God wills. If Satan rides, it wills and goes where Satan wills. Nor may it choose to which rider it will run, or which it will seek. But the riders themselves fight to decide who shall have and hold it. As if we're not, in other words, spiritual combat is between Christ and Satan. And we're not somehow protagonists in that spiritual combat. And we all know from our own personal experience, that can't be right. We are protagonists of this spiritual combat, whether we like it or not. And so it is not up to us. It is also up to us who rides rides us, no? Because we can open the way to the one or the other. We open the way to God by corresponding with his grace, and we open the way to Satan by resisting God's grace. Now, we can't do anything of ourselves, but we can, anything positive, but we can resist of ourselves. We're capable of that. And so the terrible implication of that way of reasoning, how would you not have God responsible for sin? Obviously Luther and Calvin and any other Christian is not going to want to say that. But the problem is, how do you avoid that implication? And Luther avoids it like this. He says, now the highest degree of faith is to believe that God is merciful, though he saves so few and damns so many, and to believe that he's just, though of his own will he makes us perforce proper subjects for damnation. He makes us subjects for damnation. Right? We can't hold that. Right? We make ourselves subjects for damnation. Right? So that's not the highest degree of faith, to believe that God is good and just, even though he makes us fit for damnation. Right? We have to hold that God is good and just because he gives us all the grace we need to be saved, but yet he also allows us to cooperate or resist that grace. Now, this question wasn't a marginal one in the Reformation debates. Luther thought it was the heart and center. And I think Calvin probably would have, I don't know of any citation, but I think he would have said the same. So Luther, in this book, that he wrote against Erasmus on the very title, On the Bondage of the Will. And so, For or Against Free Will. On the Bondage of the Will is the book. At the conclusion of it, he thanks Erasmus, whom he's writing against. Erasmus was defending free will. He thanks him for bringing the controversy to this central point. He writes, I give you hearty praise on this, that you alone, in contrast with the others who have attacked me, that you alone have attacked the real thing. You haven't wearied me with those extraneous issues about, the papacy, purgatory, indulgences, or such like. Right? So for Luther, indulgences was a minor matter compared to free will. Right? I think that's, he said so. Trifles rather than issues, in respect of which almost all to date have sought my blood, although without success. You and you alone have seen the hinge on which all turns, and aimed for the vital spot. Do we have free will? And in this sense of, can we resist God's grace or freely cooperate with it? Now, the Council of Trent condemned that position solemnly. And so the Council of Trent taught, if anyone shall say that man's free will, moved and aroused by God, does not cooperate by assenting to God who rouses and calls, whereby it disposes and prepares itself to obtain justification, and that it cannot dissent, it cannot resist if it wishes, but that like something inanimate, Luther makes the comparison to Lot's wife, the column of salt. He says that we're all like that we can't cooperate positively or negatively. And so the Council of Trent says, if somebody holds that, let him be anathema. Right? We can't hold that. Right? So we can cooperate and we can dissent. Or again, if anyone shall say that after the sin of Adam, man's free will was lost or destroyed, or that it's a thing in name only, a title without a reality, a fiction brought into the church by Satan, let him be anathema. Right? We didn't lose it. What we lost is the full extent of the freedom for the good. Right? We've got freedom between, but we don't have the full freedom for the good. We don't have freedom for the supernatural good without God's grace. But with God's grace, we have that too. Okay. Finally, the Council of Trent says, if anyone shall say it's not in the power of man to make his ways evil, but that God produces the evil as well as the good works, not only by permission, but properly enough himself, so that the betrayal of Judas is as much his work as the vocation of Paul, let him be anathema. And those would be some of the extreme remarks found in that book on the bondage of the will, in which Luther, drawn by passion, really takes the full consequences of that position. Okay, after the Council of Trent, that kind of position continued to exercise influence within the Catholic Church through the heresy of Jansenism. Basically, Jansenism was an attempt to mitigate a Calvinist position inside the Catholic Church. And so, it's the same idea that after the fall, human nature got totally corrupted and has lost the really the freedom to, if God gives grace, it'll be an irresistible grace, and if he doesn't give grace, man can't be saved. And so Jansenism taught, similar to Calvin, a limited atonement, that Christ didn't die for all men, but only for the elect, to whom he gives irresistible grace. And to the others, he doesn't give irresistible grace, and so we can't really say that he died for them. Right? And so the Church infallibly condemned that position. Right? Christ died for all men. Right? The good and those who resist grace to the end. He also died for them, because he gives them sufficient grace to be saved. Now, in our time, that particular debate of the the 16th and 17th century has kind of gone into the background, and new debates have come to the fore, but it's simply different ways of denying free will, and even more radically. So, for example, materialism or determinism. The idea that if you deny man's spiritual soul, and we have a kind of materialist conception of man, well, matter doesn't have free will. And so if we don't have a spiritual soul and just, our brain is our highest part, well, our brain is something material with that gray matter, well, sure, we're going to be determined. But the problem is we're not just matter. Right? And how do we know we're not just matter? One of the principal ways we know we're not just matter is because we know we have free will. Our very experience of free will refutes materialism. Another form of it would be Freudianism. The idea that we're determined by, but that just comes out of materialism. Freud was a materialist. And so he held that we're so dominated by our libido, our sexual drive, that we're not free really to. John Paul II has a beautiful response to these contemporary forms of the denial of freedom in his exhortation, Reconciliation and Penance, which is a great document on the sacrament of penance. He writes, "The individual may be conditioned, incited, influenced by numerous and powerful external factors. No one denies it. He may be subjected to tendencies, defects, habits linked to his personal condition, his temperament, his body. In not a few cases, such external and internal factors may attenuate, to greater or lesser degree, the person's freedom. Right? They can lessen it, and therefore lessen his responsibility and guilt. But it's a truth of faith, confirmed by experience, that the human person is free. Right? So these conditionings lessen, but they don't eliminate our freedom. Right? Our freedom isn't unlimited, but it's real. This truth cannot be disregarded in order to place the blame for individual sins on external factors, such as structures, systems, or other people. Now, that would be the Marxist system. Marxism denies free will because it's total materialism. And so the whole fault, the reason for evil, is economic structures. So you change the structures and you bring about universal happiness. And we saw what that led to in reality, right? The experience in communist Russia. And so John Paul II says that would be to deny the human person's dignity and freedom, which are manifested, even though in a negative and disastrous way, also in this responsibility for sin. Hence, there is nothing so personal and so untransferable in each individual as merit for virtue and responsibility for sin. Right? It's what's most us. It's how our identity, our personal identity, is most built up. Right? Our free decisions. And so we make ourselves, through our free acts, we become, as it were, our own fathers. That's a line from one of the church fathers, I think St. Gregory of Nyssa, that we become our own fathers and mothers, as it were, through our free acts. And thus, that's what gives us moral responsibility, right? Which is the root of dignity, of human dignity. Right? And everyone knows that in conscience, that experience of remorse, that some of our acts merit blame, whereas others merit praise. Right? And that's why we recognize that there should be a judgment. There must be a judgment. And every culture has some religious sense that there will be a judgment based on our acts. And so the experience of conscience shows us that we have this freedom, we're naturally free, and yet at the same time, we're not morally free. In other words, we're called to direct our freedom in a certain way, right? By the law of God. And yet we have the freedom of choice to choose that freely or not. Back in the 19th century, a great Pope, Leo XIII, wrote a stupendous encyclical on freedom. It's called Libertas, which just means freedom. And his goal there was to defend the Christian understanding of freedom within the law of God. But in order to do so, he first deals with that we have free will, and then he distinguishes this natural free will, natural freedom, from freedom for the good. So freedom between and freedom for, which he calls natural freedom and moral freedom. Moral freedom meaning freedom for the good. And first he deals with natural freedom because that's the basis for our freedom for. And he basically defends free will in the same way that we looked at earlier tonight, based on the fact that we've got reason to deliberate and a spiritual soul. And he notes that the Catholic Church, in the history of the last 2,000 years, has always been the greatest defender of free will, to all different kinds of denials of it. And as he goes on to explain free will, he makes a very important point that the ability to sin it's a consequence of free will, but it's also a defect of liberty. Right? It's a consequence of the kind of liberty we have here on earth. But in heaven, we'll still be free, but without that defect of freedom, the ability to sin. Right? So it's not of the essence of freedom to be able to sin. God is free, right? God is supremely free. Can God sin? No. Right? And so you can see from that the ability to sin isn't of the essence of freedom. The essence of freedom is to be able to choose between goods for the sake of the good. Right? That's the essence of freedom. But nevertheless, our ability to sin here, even though it's not of the essence of freedom and it's a defect of freedom, it's also a clear sign that we are free. It's like a disease being the proof of life. If you're diseased, at least you're alive. Right? So God and the blessed in heaven are free and yet not free to sin. The freedom which involves the freedom to sin is a particular kind of freedom. It's the freedom in a state of trial, and that's this life. Right? God made us, because we might ask, well, why did God make us with this defective freedom? Why didn't He make us with a perfect freedom, like the blessed in heaven? Well, the state of the blessed in heaven is the crowning. Right? That's their reward for having been faithful in a trial. And that's a very good thing, to have a reward for fidelity, a crowning. But in order for a crowning to be a crowning, first, there has to be a trial. And I think anybody who's been involved in sports can see this. It would be no fun to win the Olympic gold medal if you didn't compete. And if you did nothing, and you just got a gold medal, that would provide no satisfaction. Whereas having sweat and worked incredibly hard with incredible determination for your whole life, say, well, then that moment takes on great meaning. Well, God has done that with our lives in a much higher way. Right? Our whole life is a kind of trial, and heaven is a crowning in which we'll get a higher kind of freedom, the freedom only for the good without the ability to defect from the good. And so God is supremely free, and so are the blessed. Now, in the Gospel, Jesus says, in dialogue with those who are with whom he's in dispute, he says, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. So let's look at that. So, sin is a manifestation of our freedom. But by sinning, what are we doing? We're choosing between badly, and the result is we're losing our freedom for the good. But freely, that's the tragedy of it. We're freely consigning, as it were, giving away our freedom for the good. Not totally, because we can always, through the grace of God, turn around, but diminishing our freedom for the good. St. Thomas explains it like this. He says, when something acts of itself, right, we say that it's free. Whereas if something acts by another, we say that it's enslaved. Right? So the slave does just simply what his master tells, the will of another, right? He's not free. Now, in us, what makes us be what we are? Reason. Right? That's what makes us a rational animal. That's what makes us in the image and likeness of God. If we act on the basis of our reason, we'll be acting from ourselves. But if we act on the basis of something, say, lower in us, passion and vice, we're acting really on the basis of something, as it were, external to what makes us who we are. So the more I act on the basis of animal passions, and if I do so habitually, I get a vice of doing so, I'm, as it were, enslaved to something that's below me, in me. And that's not to be free, but to be in bondage. And it's especially tragic because it's precisely the reason that makes us free. It makes us able to choose between different goods, and thus to get to our final end, the good, the whole good. Okay, so sin creates bondage, and thus it diminishes our freedom for the good, but it never totally takes it away, as long as we're alive. What about, so in heaven, the angels and saints, the blessed, they can choose between what? Different good ways to praise and glorify God. Right? So they're free in that. They're just not free to fall away and to prefer a creature to the Creator, to God's will. And so as sin enslaves, so truth sets us free in that same sense of freedom for the good. And so in that same conversation, Jesus with the crowd, he says, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Right? The gospel for today. And so this is a crucial text for understanding freedom for. Freedom and truth go together. Right? Truth alone liberates man, and falsehood and vice bind man and destroy our liberty, ultimately, the freedom for the good. Right? So truth sets us free, and especially the full truth, the truth of the gospel sets us free, because it shows us our supernatural end. Heaven, to see God, to communion with God. And so it sets us free because it shows us where we're going and enables us to choose, through God's grace, the means to get there. And so the truth sets us free. The crowd took exception. And so they said, it was as if Jesus was saying, you're not free. And so they said, we're descendants of Abraham. We've never been in bondage to anyone. How can you say that you will be made free? And that's when he answers, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. But the slave doesn't continue in the house forever. The Son continues forever. If the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. He's speaking here of freedom for the supernatural good. So we of ourselves don't have that. Right? We need to get, without the grace of Christ, we have a certain natural freedom, but we don't have freedom for that good, which is in fact our beatitude. And so Christ liberates us through his revelation and grace. Right? Whereas sin blocks that and thus takes away our freedom for the good. Right? So, freedom of choice, right? We've got freedom of choice. Both the person who's been set free by Christ and in a state of grace, and the person who rejects that grace and is in a state of mortal sin. Both have the freedom between. Right? So both have freedom and choice. But only the one has freedom for, in the full sense. The other has the capacity for that freedom for, but only by corresponding to that grace that we can also resist. Right? So freedom of choice always will be with us as long as we live, thanks be to God, so that we can always still repent. But it's through God's grace that we have the freedom for the supernatural good, the freedom to love as Christ has loved us. Right? So freedom and truth go together. John Paul II has a beautiful saying about this in his World Youth Day. It was a letter to the youth of the world in 1985, a great discourse. And he's speaking to the youth of the world. He says, and in this, he says, Christ's words, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free, are an essential program. Right? The program of our lives. Young people, one might say, have an inborn sense of truth. They have a hunger for the truth. And truth must be used for freedom. Young people have a spontaneous desire for freedom. But what does it mean to be free? It means to know, he's asking, what's the fullest sense of freedom? And the answer is freedom for the good. To be truly free doesn't mean doing everything that pleases me. Right? That's freedom from coercion. Right? That's the lowest sense. Or doing what I want to do. Freedom contains within itself the criterion of truth. To be truly free means to use one's freedom for the true good. And we could say that freedom, by its very nature, is not opposed to the law, but requires the law of God. And so just as there's a relation between freedom and truth, so there's an essential link between freedom and the law. We tend to think in our culture that freedom and law are total opposites. Right? Freedom means to not have a law. Right? I'm free if there's no law. Whereas in reality, this kind of freedom for the good is precisely what necessitates. Law is the ordering of things to the end. And so freedom for the good means that I need a law by which I chart my life to get to the end, to get to its goal. Right? So nothing could be more crazy, really, than to think that freedom and law are contraries. Right? If God made us free and didn't give us a law by which we could get to our end, that freedom wouldn't be a good thing, right? If He just made us free and didn't give us a law to chart our way to the goal, and just kind of left us without any law, that freedom would be terrible. It would be the freedom to be aimless. Right? But freedom is such a great gift precisely because God has a law by which we use our freedom to get to the goal of our lives. And so this is one of the biggest problems, I think, in contemporary society, that people have lost that sense of the link between freedom and the law. By thinking of their countries. And a result of that is, I think, that the word law in our ears isn't one of the words we most like to say. No, it's not one of the most beautiful words in the English language. No one would say that, right? But in other cultures, not like that, and especially in Judaism. No, in Israel, in Hebrew, the most beautiful word, I think it's fair to say, or one of the most beautiful words in the Hebrew language, is Torah. Torah is the law of God. But in the mentality, in the Jewish mentality, Torah is gift, right? It's the supreme gift of how to get to our end. And so is God. God's law in English is the same. It's just that we've lost the positive associations with God's law because we think of law and freedom as in conflict. And this is one of the key issues that the recent popes take up again and again, especially John Paul II. There was a document written by then Cardinal Ratzinger, who was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, on liberation theology. Liberation theology, because it was a form of Marxism, and so it spoke constantly about liberation, but liberation from oppression of the ruling class, liberation from economic, etc. And it didn't speak about freedom for the good. Right? And so Cardinal Ratzinger gave a beautiful explanation of the link between freedom and law. He says, freedom is not the liberty to do anything whatsoever. It's the freedom to do good. Right? That's the fullest sense. And in this alone happiness is to be found. Thus, good is the goal of freedom. And we become free to the extent that we come to know the truth. And that this truth guides our will, and not other forces like our passions or vices. So liberation for the sake of a knowledge of the truth, which alone directs the will, that's freedom truly worthy of the name. Right? Whereas in contemporary society, freedom is understood by people to mean I can do whatever I want. Right? Unlimited license. And I think this is really what's behind the new atheism. And if you listen to people like Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins, what's their ultimate reason why they want to be an atheist? And there was this debate that we had at Powell Symphony Hall a couple years ago. Christopher Hitchens debating a Catholic. He said, it came down to this. He says, I can't understand why you want to believe in God. Because if God exists, we have to grovel. If there's a God, then I'm not free with that absolute freedom to be totally autonomous. And that's unacceptable. Basically, that was his fundamental argument. God can't exist because we'd have to grovel. Or God can't exist because then we won't be absolutely free. Like, this is a temptation. This is the perennial temptation of the human mind. We see it was the temptation that Satan tempted Eve with. The desire to be autonomous and thus to have dominion over good and evil ourselves and not receive it from God. And I think the philosopher who's best described this is Jean-Paul Sartre, who existentialism, atheist existentialism, and he takes as his first principle that God doesn't exist. And for the same kind of reason as Christopher Hitchens. If God exists, I'm not God, that's intolerable. But he doesn't look into that. He just takes it for granted. God doesn't exist. All right, what does the world look like if God doesn't exist? If God doesn't exist, there's no law, there's no essence, there's no human nature, and therefore we're unlimited freedom. Right? That's not true. Right? We have freedom, but we're not unlimited freedom. That would be horrible, and he recognizes it, because unlimited freedom would have no direction. If you're unlimited freedom, that's exactly what Leo XIII was saying. Unlimited freedom without law would be a curse, because you would be like free in a maze and unable to ever get where you want to go. And so Sartre recognizes we're total freedom. There's no law of God because there's no God. And therefore every man has to determine for himself good and evil, just of himself, without any criteria for doing it. Well, what if somebody were coherent with that, what would they feel like inside? Well, they'd feel without any foundation, without any moorings, you'd feel seasick. In other words, nauseous. And so this is one of the fundamental concepts of his philosophy, nausea. And he has a book called Nausea. I've talked about this before. And the wise person in Sartre's philosophy, the profound person, the person who has metaphysical insight, is the one who feels nauseous existential nausea. Because he alone will be living in the truth that we have total freedom and there's no criteria. And there's another thing. There is, though, one practical limit on our freedom, and what is it? If it's not God, it doesn't exist, it's our neighbor. Right? There's no doubt that our unlimited freedom is limited by our neighbor's unlimited freedom. And so another conclusion of this kind of philosophy is that hell would be our neighbor. He ends one of his books with that. No exit. Right, hell is, right, so he goes on, he says, it's not, old wives' tales about the red hot pokers and all that stuff. Hell exists, right? Hell is other people. That's how his book ends. And that shows us something, that shows us that this is wrong, right? That this is so profoundly wrong. And so that freedom is not unlimited, and the most beautiful expression of freedom is giving it away. And that's a kind of paradox, that freedom is the capacity in its highest level, is the capacity to first dominate ourselves, conquer ourselves, have self-dominion, precisely so that we can give ourselves freely to another. Right? You can't give what you don't have. If a person doesn't have self-possession through virtue, you can't give yourself. Take a person who can't, somebody wants to get married, but they don't have any chastity. They can't give themselves to another person because they don't possess themselves. Right? And so the truest freedom, the highest freedom, is giving ourselves to another. Right? And that's realized in human life in a beautiful way in precisely marriage vows or religious consecration. Right? Giving ourselves to another. And above all, giving ourselves to God. That's what it's for. Right? That's what our freedom is for. St. Ignatius of Loyola, his great legacy to the church is his spiritual exercises. And the very title of those spiritual exercises is revealing about the true nature of freedom. He calls them spiritual exercises to conquer oneself and regulate one's life without determining oneself through any disordered tendency. Right? That's the purpose of the spiritual exercises. To conquer oneself so that we can be truly free and thus not free ourselves from any disordered tendency, precisely so we can freely give ourselves to the will of God, for the greater glory of God. Right? And that's the sense in which Christ sets us free. Right? And so true freedom leads to self-conquest. That's not the goal. Right? The goal of self-conquest is precisely self-gift back to God.